Hi everyone. This is probably not the best idea I've ever had, but on what has been the hottest day of the year so far, I've decided to come up to the hottest part of my house to make a video about Rebecca Watson, who, against her better judgment, recently did a reaction video to Sabine Hossenfelder on trans-identifying teens. I reacted to a bit of the same video of Sabine's myself last week. In fact, what I said in that video was hived off from the copious notes I made for this one. Most of those notes I ended up crossing out and wishing I'd never started this particular project because Rebecca is insufferable and not really worth the time of day, but I might as well put that work to some use and get it over with. Sabine's video is called "Is Being Trans a Social Fad?" and Rebecca's reaction video is called "Physicist Sabine Hossenfelder Screws Up on Trans Kids Care," which is an extraordinary title given what Sabine's video is about. And Rebecca has the transcript of her response on her website at skeptic.org, where I couldn't help but notice that it has been miscategorized as skepticism. Rebecca begins by poisoning her own well, rather generously, if I may say so, but after much consideration, I've decided not to show the full extent of just how unpleasant she appears to be. For example, in her transcript, she includes links to her own behaviour elsewhere, like this tweet, which is directed at Graham Linehan, and in which she's gloating about the breakup of Graham's marriage. Anyway, in the video, she starts off by saying that she was subscribed to Sabine's channel, or is subscribed so far as I know, but doesn't watch every single video she makes, which is fair enough. Then
I scanned through her videos to make sure that she was staying more or less, scientifically accurate as far as I could tell.
I'm sure we're all very grateful that the woman with a bachelor's degree in communications or some such thing scans through the videos of a woman with a PhD in theoretical physics to make sure she is staying scientifically accurate.
And most importantly, not being problematic about social issues.
By problematic, she means expresses an opinion that differs from Rebecca's.
I'm talking about people who believe that any gender-affirming care, like using a child's preferred pronouns, is child abuse.
There you go. Gotta love how the gender loonies never engage with what we actually say. They always go with these ridiculous hyperboles. When we say transing kids is child abuse, we are talking about risky medical interventions that they are too young to understand or appreciate the full implications of, and not that using a child's preferred pronouns is abuse of the child, although allowing kids to socially transition is poor parenting, in my opinion, and I would justify that opinion by the authority of Dr. Rita Kerttu-Kaltiola, Finland's top expert on gender pediatric medicine, who points to evidence that 4 out of 5 children who are not socially transitioned do desist and become reconciled with their sex, whereas if they are socially transitioned prior to reaching puberty, virtually none desist. And if you don't want to trust Dr. Kaltiola's judgment, you can read the trials yourself. The site statsforgender.org has links to them. I'll link below. Of course, as I've shown in a previous video, Rebecca is in denial about the harms done by puberty blockers, so she probably won't see any harm in children being on that trajectory. I would also mention Stephanie Davies-Arai of Transgender Trend, who has a lot of expertise. And she said at the GenSpec conference in Ireland recently that going with preferred pronouns, what she called queering the classroom, disrupts language development in children and can be very confusing and distressing for kids on the autism spectrum.
Like, no one is going to be right about everything all the time, but I don't want to accidentally promote someone who turns out to like mindlessly parrot transphobic talking points or something, right?
She wants them to mindlessly parrot gender bollocks like she does. Before going on to her response about Sabina, I will just show one bit of her video that I found amusing.
Allow me to address something that happens every time I make a video talking about trans issues. Inevitably, some hardcore transphobes will show up and comment that I myself am a trans woman. And the comment makes it obvious that they think that this is an epic burn.
Hey, that's exactly what members of the gender cult do to me. How about that? Here's a recent one congratulating me on my successful transition. They do it so often, I even made a video about it. And when I posted that video, I got loads of TERFs, which, as you know, stands for Truly Excellent Real Feminists, saying the same thing happens to them. And not by transphobes, but by the men who are in thrall to the very same misogynistic ideology promoted by Rebecca.
Friends, I need you to know something. I don't think it's an insult to be trans, because I know a lot of trans women, and I know that they have all kinds of different appearances, including some being way hotter and way more traditionally feminine than me. So you, the person making the comment, you're the one who thinks that it's an insult, not me.
I'm sure a lot of people think that trans-identifying men are way hotter than you, Rebecca, but what you seem to be missing here is that these guys saying that are trying to insult you by pretending to think you're a man, saying, oh, but some of those men in dresses are super hot and more feminine than I am, is not the gotcha you seem to think it is. For many men, one of the worst insults they think they can fling at a woman is that she looks like a man. You know it, and I know it. What they don't seem to grasp is that we honestly don't care. Or at least, I don't care. Judging women by their looks and criticising us for failure to live up to some feminine ideal constructed by them is what men have done throughout history. This is one of my favourite troll comments. I know you're really just mad because trans females look more feminine than you do. Okay. You look like my plumber brother-in-law. Sound kind of like him too, now that I think about it. Lucky brother-in-law. Now, on to the serious business. Remember how Sabine started her video?
On the one side, you have people claiming that it's a socially contagious fad among the brainwashed woke who want to mutilate your innocent children. On the other side, there are those saying that it's saving the lives of minorities who've been forced to stay in the closet for too long. And then there are normal people like you and I who think both sides are crazy, and could someone please summarize the facts in simple words, which is what I'm here for.
This is known as false balance or both sidesism, a rhetorical trick that pretends to demonstrate an unbiased viewpoint, but in reality, you are being biased by default by comparing something backed up by reams of scientific data with something that has no basis in reality. You're equating those two things when they are not, in fact, equal.
I just plucked that bit out of a whole bunch of stuff Rebecca said about Sabina's introduction because it is particularly outrageous. We know that she is on the other side of this debate. I'm talking about Rebecca now. So is she seriously claiming that the side which says men can be women, women can be men, that so-called gender-affirming treatments are safe and effective has reams of scientific data behind it? While the other side, which says people can't change sex and that turning physically healthy people into lifelong medical patients isn't a good idea, that side has no basis in reality. Both of these statements are demonstrable falsehoods. And Rebecca is also, in my opinion, wrong with her accusation that Sabina is doing false balance or both-sidism. And she accuses her of it repeatedly throughout the video about different things Sabina says. This is an accusation usually thrown at journalists, with good reason thrown at journalists who think that to demonstrate impartiality when they write an an article or conduct an interview or something, they have to show two sides of an argument equally, even when one side is patently ridiculous. Years ago, I went to a show in which Dara O'Brien did a few gags about this. Here's a clip.
It's nonsense. And they'll have this all the time with medical stuff on the television. You'll have a doctor on and they'll talk to the doctor and be, oh, doctor this and doctor that, and what happened there, and doctor, isn't it awful, right? And then the doctor will be talking about something with all the benefit of research and medical evidence, and they'll turn away from the doctor in the name of balance and turn to some quack witch doctor, homeopath, horseshit peddler on the other side of the studio.
That was spot on. He gave another example, a less plausible scenario, and obviously a joke, about a professor of dentistry given equal interview time with a man who removes a decayed tooth with a piece of string and a door. Or you could have, say, someone like Richard Dawkins, evolutionary biologist, author of, maybe 20 science books, emeritus professor of, I think it was the Public Understanding of Science at Oxford University. You could have him given equal time with some semi-educated, mouthy vlogger like Rebecca Watson. But Sabine isn't doing that. She's not trying to be a journalist giving equal time to both sides while staying impartial herself. She's trying to inform people about one very controversial thing, namely the huge and rapid rise in the transgendering of adolescents, which is part of the bigger culture war we are engaged in against the regressives. And she does this by providing some data on numbers and also looking at some very limited evidence that has been collected. But she's not giving a voice to anyone else. She's making a video from her own perspective, which is not entirely neutral, just as I make videos that reflect my perspective, which is certainly not neutral, and just as Rebecca talks a load of rubbish from her own perspective. Here is an example. I'll show what each of us says about Lisa Lippman's research into ROGD, rapid onset gender dysphoria.
Littman's paper was strongly criticized for not being a scientific study, but a collection of experience reports from parents. The parents were recruited among frequent visitors to websites who are skeptical that transgender self-identification among teenagers is genuine. This means the sample is unlikely to be representative.
She correctly states that the term was popularized by a paper written by Dr. Lisa Lippman that was controversial as it only described the opinions of parents of transgender kids, and those parents were all found on forums for people who don't think transgender people exist.
Lisa had selected 3 websites on which parents had reported what appeared to be rapid onset of gender dysphoria in their own kids. So these websites were Fourth Wave Now, Transgender Trend, and Youth Transcritical Professionals. Links to all 3 can be found on the children page of my site. These 3 sites posted a link to a questionnaire that Lisa had devised, and she asked that it be shared to anyone who might be interested. As a result, it ended up on a private Facebook page called Parents of Transgender Children, I think, which had 8,000 members at the time and is supportive, probably what this idiot would call a pro-trans site. So while Sabine's framing and her description of the websites that Lisa Lippman initially went to is fairer than is Rebecca's, the notion that Lisa only recruited from those websites what Wikipedia calls anti-trans websites isn't true. The sample was more representative than that, but ultimately Lisa did only get, I think it was 256 cases that met the inclusion criteria, and it was a survey of parents, not of the young people themselves. Sabine concludes that the evidence for ROGD is inconclusive, though she mentions there is anecdotal evidence in support of it from doctors working in gender clinics. In fact, there is a massive amount of anecdotal evidence from the parents of such kids and from detransitioners too. On the other hand, Rebecca is quite rabid in her opposition to the very notion of ROGD.
There, as far as I can tell, there's absolutely no evidence that rapid onset of gender dysphoria is anything other than a boogeyman made up by transphobes obsessing about trans people online.
I mean, why would transphobes, or more accurately, those of us opposed to the transgendering of minors, make it up? What real and important difference does it make if there are kids who've been influenced by social media and or friendship groups to seek medical transition, or whether they've always felt unhappy in their sex for some other reason? In other words, why does it matter when their psychological problems started? What matters, surely, is finding out what causes them. And whatever the cause of them is, that they are properly explored with the help of responsible healthcare professionals rather than those Kool-Aid drinkers and those that are out to make a fast buck. And what's important is that appropriate mental health care is provided to those who need it. Nothing changes the truth that nobody was born into the wrong body and there is no such thing as a trans child. Ultimately, I don't think the 5-year-old debate about whether ROGD exists or not matters too much in the scale of things, so I'm not going to show the whole of their tedious comments on it. One part of Sabina's introduction that I omitted in my video about her because it wasn't relevant to what I wanted to say about her, but which Rebecca also admitted, even though it's very relevant to what Rebecca has to say, is this.
And why are some countries like Sweden, Finland, and the UK rolling back gender-affirming treatments for children?
In fact, England's National Health Service has just announced that it will no longer prescribe puberty blockers to children except as part of clinical research. Given what we already know about the risks of puberty blockers, and I covered them as comprehensively as I could in a previous video, good luck getting ethical approval for any kind of research that involves putting human children on these powerful drugs. To those 3 countries, by the way, we can now add Norway, which recently announced it would revise its current guidelines on so-called gender-positive care for minors, saying it was no longer considered evidence-based. And very significantly, doubts have now come to the Netherlands, which is where so much of this stuff started. Next.
She goes on to say, though, that the number of children expressing gender dysmorphia is higher than the number of adults, which she calls puzzling.
Sabine actually speaks for over 3 minutes, giving quite a lot of information from different countries about the rise in kids calling themselves trans and seeking medical transition. It is data that is in the public domain and will already be known more or less by people who follow this subject very closely. But I do find it odd that this very significant phenomenon of a massive rise in kids, especially girls, identifying as transgender is barely mentioned by Rebecca, as if it's of no importance to her when it should be hugely concerning, especially to someone who identifies as a feminist, and it is apparently the very reason Sabine made the video that Rebecca reacted to. In a previous video, I went into some detail about the risks of puberty blockers, so I'm not going to cover what Sabine says about them or what Rebecca says about them because they don't add anything useful. I'm just going to focus on what I think is the worst thing in Rebecca's video. The worst thing she says is this.
I guess since I am solidly on one of those crazy sides she mentions, I just wanted to address it first and foremost. You know, we're saying that allowing transgender teens to transition, which I think she means get gender affirming care, is saving lives. And yeah, it is.
No, it isn't saving lives. That is an outrageously bold and unsupportable claim. We are not talking about a cure for a physical disease here. We are talking about physical interventions for mental health conditions. What would happen if those with this particular mental health condition were not given what is referred to as gender affirming care? There is a clear implication in Rebecca's phrasing that at least some of those people would end up committing suicide. Now, if it were the case that prior to the introduction of so-called gender-affirming care, there was evidence of large numbers of youngsters known to be very depressed and in particular distressed about their sex, what is called gender dysphoria, if there was any evidence that many of them were committing suicide and that the incidence of suicide had diminished after the gender-affirming protocol had been introduced, that would suggest a causal link that needed investigation. But apparently there is no such evidence. I have looked for it. Rebecca doesn't provide any, so why should we believe it? Even though trans-identifying kids have higher rates of depression and suicide ideation, actual suicide is extremely rare amongst them. Suicidality refers to suicidal thoughts, plans, gestures such as self-harm, which tend to be seen as cries for help, as well as apparently serious but unsuccessful attempts. Serious attempts at suicide are also extremely rare, but suicidality is not suicide, which of course means successfully killing oneself. So the references that Rebecca claims backs up her belief that gender-affirming treatments save lives are actually studies on depression and suicide ideation. And there is some evidence, for the most part pretty sketchy, that gender-affirming treatments help diminish depression and suicidality in some young people, not that they actually save lives. Rebecca gives 4 links to papers she claims back up her belief. The first one is conducted by researchers affiliated with an LGBTQ advocacy organisation called the Trevor Project, which should raise a red flag about their objectivity. It's being widely shared by enthusiasts for gender affirmation treatments, some of them saying wrongly that it proves that the treatments lower the suicide rate, and pointing to the large number of participants. Now, a large number of participants is good unless they are self-selected through a biased medium, as they are in this case. In fact, the Trevor Project study recruited young people through targeted adverts on Facebook, Instagram, and Snapchat. Remember Rebecca pointing out that Lisa Littman had placed adverts on what she called websites that say trans people don't exist? Double standards much? The second major flaw is that there is no control group of gender dysphoric young people against which to compare those who are getting the treatments. And this is a flaw shared with every other trial of gender-affirming treatments that I know of, or I can think of. If this were a homeopathy trial, recruiting from followers of homeopathy pages on Facebook and other social media platforms and didn't have a control group, I have no doubt that Rebecca would give it all the scorn such a trial would deserve. But when it comes to so-called gender-affirming treatments, it seems that, like so many self-proclaimed skeptics, she has a blind spot. She ring-fences them from skeptical inquiry. Below, I'll link to a letter by a member of the parents' support group GenSpect, making some salient points about this particular study and studies involving gender dysphoric kids in general, including that these kids and young people can become fixated and very anxious on starting treatments, and this anxiety can, quotes, reverse the association between a factor associated with anxious feelings and mental health. It's hardly surprising when someone has been waiting for what they hope and expect will be the cure for their unhappiness, that their depression and any suicide ideation will diminish when they finally get on the treatment. The GenSpect parent uses the analogy of anorexia nervosa, saying that the current mental health of young anorectics who are restricting their food intake is likely to be better. They'll be less anxious and depressed and coping more effectively than those who aren't restricting their food intake. So doing the thing that is physically harmful makes them feel better, but it's not better for them. It goes on. Eating disorder therapists warn families that as the anorexic in recovery approaches their higher weight target, anxiety and suicidality risks may peak. This can be the most dangerous period. If you were to compare the mental health of anorexics in treatment who are still underweight with those approaching a healthy weight, you will find much higher rates of suicidality and anxiety in the healthy weight recovering anorexic. But no one would interpret this as meaning anorexics should not achieve a healthy weight. I think that's a very useful analogy, but no doubt Rebecca would disagree. For a study to be useful, it needs to be longitudinal and last at least 10 years, I would have thought. And the next study Rebecca links to, which is entitled Mental Health Outcomes in Transgender and Non-Binary Youths Receiving Gender Affirming Care, published in February 22 and covering kids aged 13 to 16, is absolutely useless because it only covers the first year of being treated. The reason it does so is because it claims, wrongly, that there is already a robust evidence base for teenagers and young adults who've been on these treatments for longer and or have had the surgeries. I checked the references for this specific claim and spent ages reading the papers, and it's just wrong. This is one of the most rubbish papers I've ever read. The third paper she links to, which is only about puberty blockers, has already been very competently debunked, and even if it hadn't, I'd be inclined to disregard it because it was led by Jack L. Turbone, whose reputation as a pharma shill precedes him. It is widely known that he has received at least one substantial payment by the manufacturers of triptorelin, which is used off-label to block puberty in gender dysphoric adolescents, a use for which Jack L. Turbone promotes them. Fancy that. Anyway, Rebecca links to the paper, and if we scroll down, we see a few fawning comments and some very substantive criticisms from, amongst others, Dr. Paul Cruz, an endocrinologist of Washington University Medical School, who's got some interesting lectures on video right here on YouTube, and our very own expert, Professor Michael Biggs of Oxford University, both of whom I'm inclined to trust more than someone paid to promote puberty blockers. By the way, Michael Biggs did a very informative lecture at the recent GenSpect conference in which he covers where the notion of the trans child came from. If that isn't enough, this study is one of 7 dismantled with admirable rigour by Jessie Single. Frankly, I'm amazed that even Rebecca saw any merit at all in this paper. I wonder if she actually reads the papers she recommends, or does she just look at the abstract's conclusion and recommends them if they say what she wants to hear? Does she read the criticisms, or does she not even look for them? Why does she call herself a skeptic, or has she abandoned all pretense like her mate P.Z. Myers has? The fourth paper she links to I can't access without paying, but it's older than the others, so no reason to assume it's any better.
Okay, I'll stop there. That was just a really quick search of the literature. The evidence is overwhelming. Gender-affirming care, which includes the use of puberty blockers sometimes, and even more importantly, hormone therapy, most likely prevents suicides. You can disagree with those studies if you'd like, even if you're just a physicist, but is it fair to call those researchers and the people who accept this preponderance of findings, this consensus, crazy?
Given the very poor quality of the studies, I'd say that calling her crazy is being rather charitable. She is spreading misinformation about a topic that is hurting young people, and she doesn't need to. Why is she so invested in this ideology, this anti-feminist and homophobic ideology? I just can't. I'm stopping here. Thanks for watching. Bye.
My daughter was not a boy trapped in a girl's body. She had mental health issues. Against my consent, my daughter was given testosterone instead of therapy. The LGBTQ group used her to raise money for them. Look at the poor reject trans boy, they said. Why are there so many transgender in foster care? Because this state take them from their families, tell them to run, then steal them. Parents are given one option to treat their distressed child: affirm, drug, and remove their healthy body part, or else lose your child. The abuse claim against me was finally dropped, but it was too late. The damage was done. By then, my daughter was in a horrible mental and physical pain. My daughter knelt down in front of a train. She was murdered by gender ideology. I beg you, stop pushing gender ideology. I don't want any parent to feel what I feel every day.